Hello and welcome back to Filling in the History. This is going to be episode 4. We are going to be in the Joseph Smith history today, a little further into the story. We've got a lot of really fun stuff for you today, and I keep talking about we. It's really just me, the royal we. A lot to talk about today. So I hope I can fill all this in. I went down a few rabbit holes, and I think in the last episode talking about the first vision, there was a lot of things that just kind of went on, but I just wanted to be sure that all of the information was out there. And this one is no different because we're going to be talking about a couple of things. So we're going to have 5 parts today. The last part being a little bit more of kind of less on the factual side, more, again, kind of maybe just an opinion piece on this. But we're going to talk about a couple of things that are very important in Latter-day Saint church history. So now we're going to get into some stuff that's kind of on the strange side for a 21st century audience. So our 5 parts today: Moroni. We're going to talk about the hill Cumorah. We're going to talk about the 4 years in between when all this stuff happened and the plates come into Joseph's hands. A little segment called Mr. Harris Goes to New York. And then after that, we're going to be, the final segment is going to be on Alvin Smith and Joseph Smith Sr. So those are the major talking points today. So I'm going to jump right into it because I want to make sure this is concise. So I hope you enjoy this. There was some really fun stuff, and this is one of the reasons why I really love the Joseph Smith papers, and I hope this works out. So a little nervous about this one. I did a lot of research on this one this week. So anyway, so part 1, Moroni. Moroni, for maybe the non-believing audience, or if you're not as familiar with our ways and our people. So on top of every temple, most temples, this started with the Salt Lake Temple, you have a golden statue of more or less a man in a kind of a flowing robe with a horn, and it's usually facing east. Not always, but usually facing east. That is what we call the Angel Moroni. It's the statue of Angel Moroni. It was designed, I believe, originally for the Salt Lake City Temple. And the reason why this is such an important part of it, and a lot of people have wondered, oh, that's Mormon or something like that. As far as I know, we never have an angel Mormon, which is a little strange perhaps because it is called the Book of Mormon. And because of that title, the nickname for Latter-day Saints is Mormons. But Mormon was a prophet historian who collaborated and brought together, collaborated is the wrong word, I would say collated everything together for the Book of Mormon as we know it today. But he died before it finished. Sort of the Nephite and what I like to call the Lehite, but the Nephite Lamanite civilization that he represented collapsed, and he was one of the last. And so what he did is passed it on to his son, Moroni. And what we get in this story is that Joseph Smith, 3 years later, so he's 14 years old when he has the first vision story. Now he's 17 years old, and he's not sure about his standing with God, and he feels like he hasn't committed any major sins, but he says he's guilty of levity, and that he probably should be doing better than that for a guy who's seen, God and Jesus Christ. And so he says a prayer in his room one night. We get a lot of details about that, and this angel appears to him in person and gives him instructions and continues to visit him and is sort of the curator of this thing called the Book of Mormon. And he also kind of curates and protects the process of getting it translated into English. And so that's the story, is we have a lot of depictions of Moroni because Moroni was the angel that appeared to Joseph Smith and delivered the Book of Mormon to him, is what the story goes. So that being said, I'm going to go through going to be going through a couple of things, couple of different stories about this. So here we go. So what I find interesting about the first vision, so this is 14-year-old Joseph Smith, and there's not really a whole lot of talk about him sharing this a whole lot. And I don't know, the record isn't very clear that it's like, you can't tell anybody. There's the understated thing that he says to his mom of I found out for myself, that a certain church isn't true or whatever. A little understated. But all we have for that is spring 1820. That's all we have. So, for me, that could be March to May. We have no idea where. But in this case, it's different. We now have the 21st of September, 1823. very specifically. That is shared in draft 2, the Wentworth letter, the Rupp account, a lot of like Orson Pratt's thing. They're very clear on the 21st of September, 1823. A lot of these other accounts actually don't give quite as much detail as draft 2 does, which is what we call the Joseph Smith history and what is in the Joseph Smith history. I keep showing you my paperback version. I'm going to let it go. I'll trust that you know that I have a paperback version of the history of the church. But anyway, so what we get in the history of the church is in my opinion, the most detailed account that we have. The most details about the dates and so forth. I will say, though, in 1832 history, it says, quote, it was on the 22nd day of September, AD 18, and then the numbers get a little jumbled there. And thus he appeared unto me 3 times in one night, and one on the next day. So that is not the handwriting of Joseph Smith, but that is the same account where Joseph Smith did write it with his own hand. And for some reason, we're a day off. Hopefully we can forgive that, whatever. And then, you can get into the details of like, well, was it the evening of the 21st, or was it, 2 a.m. on the 22nd? I don't know if it really necessarily matters too much, but I'm an amateur historian, so I guess I don't need to care. Anyway, so we do get something from a man named John Corll, which I could not find a photo for him. But the record says sometime in AD 1825, as nearly as I can recollect, Smith was informed by an angel that there was a valuable record concealed in the earth. So again, some vague things out there in other accounts that are in the Joseph Smith papers, but the best account that we have seems to be the 21st of September, 1823. So again, this is 3 years on. Joseph Smith at this point is 16 years old because his birthday is in December. That's my math. And he, again, is praying about, please forgive me of my sins and please help me to know where my standing was. And it's interesting in his account. He says, well, it worked once. It's probably going to work again, that I'm going to get a manifestation. So that's what he does. And in draft 2, in the Joseph Smith history, we get a very detailed version of the clothes that Moroni wears, the kind of light, this sort of transport system of a conduit to heaven. We get the fact that, it seems like he can see his chest and kind of can tell that he's not wearing any other clothes underneath his angelic robe, which is very white. His head is bare. He doesn't have anything covering his head. His hands are bare. His feet are bare. And he comes to Joseph Smith and never touches the floor. So there's a lot of details there about him. We don't get a description in 1832 accounts. So this is, that's Joseph Smith's own handwriting with others. We don't get any description in the Wentworth letter. We don't get any description in the Rupp, the Ecclesiasta. I'm not going to brutalize that anymore. But anyway, the book that he wrote about Christian churches. Besides the fact that there was a glorious person, the angel had some glory to it. Orson Pratt's account is interesting. It says, quote, the stature of this personage was a little above the common size of men in this age. Average height guy. Makes me feel better anyway. His garment was perfectly white and had the appearance of being without seam. This glorious being declared himself to be an angel of God sent forth by commandment to communicate to him that his sins were forgiven and that his prayers were heard. So that's what you get. He does say that Joseph Smith's name will be had for good and evil throughout the world because in consequence to this, which is a theme that, and I think a prophecy that's definitely come true. I mean, there's a lot of people who think very violently and negatively towards Joseph Smith, all the way to people who reveal him as a prophet. So yeah, I think that's something that's definitely come true. And then we get to the job. So anecdotally, there was a talk given by Gordon B. Hinckley, who used to be a president of the church, and he said it's interesting. You get a 16-year-old kid kneeling down to pray, and he's like, "Am I forgiven? What is my deal?" You have an angel come down and says, "Hey, my name is Moroni. I've been sent from God, and you're going to go to work, right?" And he says that there's some plates deposited. There's some other objects with them, and he starts describing a few things. We get 2 in draft 2. We get 2 in the Joseph Smith history. We get the gold plates, which the engravings are on, that was in Reformed Egyptian, that he's supposed to translate in English. But what I find interesting is that this is a kid who doesn't really know how to read, and he doesn't write very well, as you've probably seen with some of the things that I've shown. Um, it's like your job is to not only your job is to translate an entire work from an ancient language that no one knows into English, which you don't know very well. So that's a pretty tall order. So he says, yes, there's also this thing called a Urim and Thummim. And we have some indications that even Oliver Cowdery may have used this to translate for a little while. That's Doctrines and Covenants, section 9. But that's what Joseph Smith used almost exclusively. Like I said, maybe Oliver Cowdery used it to do this. Now, Urim and Thummim, where do we get that from? It's Hebrew. It translates into lights and perfections, although there's maybe perfections means innocence. It could also mean knowledge, lights and knowledge, or light and truth. But lights and perfections is sort of the common translation from the Hebrew. And it is part of Hebrew history. Where you can find it, the first instance of it is in Exodus 28:30 from the King James Version. And thou shalt put in the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim, or you can say Tumim, depending on how you want to say it. And they shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goeth in before the Lord. And Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually. So there's all these stones on this ephod or this breastplate, and each one of the stones represents a tribe of the house of Israel. And then in it, so a lot of people would say maybe there was a pouch behind it or a container. That's where this Urim and Thummim would be placed. And in the Hebrew tradition, they were two stones. One was Urim, one was Thummim, right? You also see this in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1 Samuel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. I won't go into all those, but these are the references here. However, what's really interesting is that you also get this on the Yale University coat of arms in the Hebrew with lux, and I'm probably butchering this, but lux et veritas, light and truth. That is the Yale, I guess, motto. That's what is in Latin underneath. And from what I've been told in the Hebrew, up here in the Hebrew section, like kind of looks like the Ten Commandments. Apparently that translates into Urim and Thummim. Or maybe it's up there saying light and perfection. But Urim and Thummim is on the Yale, according to some sources that I've read. That is what that translates into. So if I'm incorrect about that, let me know. But some of this I would agree with. And you're also going to see this on the University of Montana seal. Looks at Veritas, and Indiana University has the same thing, looks at Veritas. This is very interesting. So one of the things that I find interesting is this etching that is from 1705, I believe, which is a depiction of how the Lord speaks through the high priest, through the Urim and Thummim, and presents characters in front of that person, kind of projects them in a way that they can read them. So this is a depiction from, again, I believe it's 1705, and down on the bottom you can see there the words, lux et veritas. So that is obviously a Latin translation, but this apparent Urim and Thummim phrase or words are commonly translated into the Latin, which is again used from at least these three universities that I've seen. So something I wanted to point out about this, I also looked through the Book of Mormon. There is no reference to Urim and Thummim in the Book of Mormon. There is a reference to interpreters. There is a reference to other stones, but the words Urim and Thummim are not used. That is an Old Testament language that we're using. It is very heavily used in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the early stages of the Doctrine and Covenants, because Joseph would use the Urim and Thummim not just to translate the Book of Mormon into English, but also would inquire, as they would say, they would inquire through the Urim and Thummim and gain answers to revelations. And I'm going to get into the details of that a little later on, but this is a very interesting and a very strange thing for some people to accept. So I'm going to get into some more detail about that. So after he says, okay, there's some plates, there's a Urim and Thummim, then the angel Moroni starts quoting the Bible. And the first scripture that we get is from Malachi. And he says that it reads a little differently than the King James Version that he was reading. And he quotes it differently in two different instances. The first verse out of chapter 4 and the last two verses out of chapter 4. where he says, that, the earth will burn as an oven. And then at the end of it, he doesn't say, I will send unto you Elijah the prophets, and the hearts of the fathers were turned to the children, and hearts of the children to their fathers. So there's kind of the fathers going in one direction and the children going in the other. In this case, what he says is, I will send on you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah, and he shall plant in the children the promises made to the fathers. So there's no fathers involved. There's just a promise made. And then the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. So it's a very different reading. Now, what's interesting about this is, and I wanted, again, a huge, enormous gratitude and shout out, whatever you want to call it, to the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Community of Christ. I know they've gone through name changes, but that organization, in whatever word they're using right now, which is, I believe, the Community of Christ, has done such an enormous effort that is something I am immensely grateful for. I bought this book, for example. This is called Joseph Smith's New Translation of the Bible, or what people call the inspired version of the Bible. This is a book that I bought in Nauvoo. That is the Joseph Smith translation. And thanks to the Community of Christ, we still have this. And it's enormously important to the Latter-day Saint faith as well as to the Community of Christ. And this book is not a Bible. This book, as you can see, are two columns. And this is just one edition of this, but you get the inspired version, and then you also get to see the King James version on the other side. So you can kind of compare the two. This is the inspired version. Joseph Smith's translation was never finished. He worked on it over the years in a lot of different ways. That's where a lot of our Pearl of Great Price comes from. So Joseph Smith Matthew is a Joseph Smith translation. The Book of Moses, as we call it, is a Joseph Smith translation. And in Latter-day Saint scriptures, they're in the footnotes. There's a whole section in the appendix about Joseph Smith's alternative translations to things. So an enormous gift and an immense amount of gratitude, at least from me, to the Community of Christ for keeping this going. All that being said, he quotes Malachi, he quotes Isaiah 11, Acts chapter 3, Joel chapter 3, and none of these scriptures have a Joseph Smith translation. None of them do. Malachi, you would think, an angel came down and gave me another translation of Malachi. It is not in the Joseph Smith translation. And if it blows your mind at all, in 3rd Nephi, in the Book of Mormon, Jesus Christ is speaking to the Nephites and quotes Malachi. And it is the same wording that we use in the King James Version. So even in the Book of Mormon, we're not quoting it the same way that Moroni did here. 2nd Nephi chapter 2 famously has a lot of Isaiah chapters in it. Isaiah 11 as well as in there. No change. Acts chapter 3, even in the Joseph Smith history, draft 2, it's pretty much the same. It shows up the same way in 3rd Nephi, chapter 20. Then you also get Joel chapter 3, no change. So what I find interesting is, though Moroni, like this angel is coming through the wall and talking to this kid, none of these show up in the Joseph Smith translation. And even in the Book of Mormon, the Malachi scripture is the same as the King James Version has it. So in Latter-day Saint scripture anyway, that is why Malachi, that excerpt from Joseph Smith's encounter with the Moroni, is in Doctrine and Covenants section 2, which is chronologically the first thing that we get. So, and it's not a revelation. It's just an excerpt from his history because it is a different interpretation of scripture. And there's a lot that we can get into about family history and temple work and why we build temples and all that. But that is why we have section 2, in my opinion. And even the reorganization never did that. They never put it down as a Joseph Smith translation. So I find that very interesting. So all the scriptures that he quotes is pretty much what we have. So in a sense that has given us some comfort. And one of the reasons I believe why one of our articles of faith says, yes, we do believe in the Bible as far as it is translated correctly, because, there's other translations of the Bible. Anyway. So just some side notes on that I find interesting is that, again, Malachi, or what we would call Doctrine and Covenants section 2, appears nowhere else besides the Joseph Smith history. And section 2 is just lifted from the Joseph Smith history. So kind of an interesting side note there. So Moroni does this whole thing. He quotes scripture, and he tells them where the plates are, and the Urim and Thummim, and he says you're forgiven and all this stuff. And then apparently the light gathers around him, and a conduit is opened into heaven, and he exits the building, Then he comes back again a second time, repeats everything that he just said. from his first visit and adds to it that there's some items about the judgment of the world. Light gathers around, he goes off into heaven again. Comes back a third time, repeats everything from the first 2 visits, and adds to it there's this temptation that he will have to sell these plates for money because they are gold. And we'll get into that. Very much comes true. And that's one of the very, very interesting things about this history that I find fascinating, is there's a lot of faults. There's a lot of problems with these people. They are not perfect. So something to think about. So Moroni warns him. And then the cock crows and it's morning time. So this has been going all night long with this 16-year-old kid. So Joseph goes to work for his father the next day, and his dad is seeing that something is wrong. According to draft 2, he tries to climb a fence. He doesn't quite make it. He collapses, and he looks up, and there's Angel Moroni again, a 4th time. He repeats the first, the second, the third visit. Everything is repeated exactly the same. And then he says, go tell your father. There's not a whole lot of other stories, other alternatives. I mean, basically, Joseph says, I went to tell my dad. He said it was of God, so I went off to the hill to find the plates. A vision was opened up to his mind overnight, and he knew what he was looking for when he got there. But that's all we get out of draft 2. So using Lucy Mack Smith's version of this, and because this is part of the Joseph Smith papers, we get the Corey's, Howard Corey, Martha Corey's handwriting in the Joseph Smith papers. I'm including it here. And there's a lot of corrections. So if it doesn't read right, I'm sorry. But I love this account. I think this is really, there's a lot of very touching things in here to me about the love of this family towards their son. So Lucy Mack Smith's account about this. The next day, he and his father and his brother Alvin were reaping in the field together when suddenly Joseph stopped and seemed to be in a deep study for some time. Alvin hurried him, saying, Joseph, we must keep to work, or we shall not get our store task done. Joseph worked again diligently, then stopped in the same way again, a second time. When Alvin, his father, I think that means and his father, saw that he was very pale, and urged him to go to the house and to tell his mother that he was sick. He went a short distance till he came to a green sward under an apple tree, where he lay down on his face, for he was so weak he could go no farther. The personage whom he saw the night before came to him again and said, Why did you not tell your father what I told you? Joseph said he was afraid his father would not believe him. He will, said the angel, believe every word you say to him. He then told you, when you get the record, take it immediately to the house and lock it up as soon as possible, and let no one see it till it is translated, and then show it to such as the Lord chooses as a witness to the world. Your father will believe you. It's a pretty touching story. That is not an official account. There's a couple of very big differences, obviously, in who was involved. But I don't know. Like I said, for me, it's just kind of a fun alternative to what we get out of draft 2. Then we start getting communications to the family out of this as well. So we kind of go in draft 2 straight to okay, here's the plates, and he describes the box they're in and all that kind of stuff. But before we get to that, there's another story that Lucy Mack tells that I find interesting. The first communication to his family. So apparently the angel Moroni says, your mind, but you must keep your mind always stayed upon God, that no evil may come into your heart. So Joseph then promised to do as he was told by the angel, and rose up and went to his brother Alvin, and requested Alvin to go to the house and ask his father to come to the field, for said he, I have something to tell him. When his father went to him, Joseph rehearsed to him all that he had seen and heard. When they came into the house that in the evening, they made known to the whole family the wonderful things which Joseph had made known unto him and them. Joseph told the whole family the wonderful things which he had been made known unto. When Joseph came in the evening, he told all the whole family all that he had made known unto his father in the field. We sat up very late and listened attentively to all that he had to say to us. But his mind was so exercised that he became very much fatigued. So this kid, according to Lucy Mack's history, is he's very weak. Like his father sends him home because he thinks he's sick. Then he comes back to Alvin, says, "Can you go get Father? I really have something I need to tell you guys." So he says it to him. And the first response, according to Lucy Mack, is they come back to the house that evening and say, "Everybody, gather around. Joseph has something to say." And he's just tired. And he gets excited and he's telling the story and he just kind of gets fatigued. Now I'm going to get into a very touching story about Alvin later on that I think deserves to be told. It's a little off topic, so it's in another part. But Alvin, as you may or may not know, actually dies of basically a calomel gets lodged in his stomach as a doctor is trying to help him with some stomach issues that he has, and it winds up killing him. And it's something that his family takes really hard. In fact, later on, Alvin is such an influence that apparently Joseph was grieving so much about his brother Alvin that he felt like he needed to focus on maybe getting married and learning to love somebody else and just kind of moving on from it. So it was a very, very important person in their lives. And so I love that, and I didn't know this because this is sort of an appendix to the Joseph Smith papers, but so it wasn't any of the printed volumes when I first read the series, but Lucy Mack puts Alvin back into a main part of the story. So in our next part, we're going to be talking about the hill Cumorah itself and some of the items that are there. And welcome to part 2. This is Cumorah, or as a lot of people call it, the hill Cumorah. This is a location that's still there. It's in Palmyra, New York. There's as they say, a hill of considerable size. And during the interviews that the angel Moroni has with Joseph Smith, apparently a vision is open to Joseph's mind, so he kind of knows where to go. And so as draft 2 says it, he goes back to his father. His father says, "It is of God. Why don't you go do what the angel told you to do?" And in Lucy Mack's account, it's, "Hey, yes, it is of God. Let's go tell our family about it." And there's a whole story after that. But it's not quite so immediate in Lucy Mack's story that Joseph goes to the hill Cumorah. Either way, he eventually goes. And this is what we get. So there's a big old stone and it's got some earth around it. And so Joseph grabs a stick of some kind, a lever, kind of cranks on it. It comes loose and there it is. There's the Urim and Thummim. There's a breastplate. There's plates, just like the angel said. And that's from draft 2. I'll get to some of the other items in a second, but so that's the draft 2 description. I'm going to give the other descriptions. So this one's from, I believe Oliver Cowdery is handwriting his here. You get a stone top and a stone box that's made out of some kind of a cement. So this is what he says. Oliver Cowdery's account says, "First, a hole of significant depth, how deep I know not, was dug. At the bottom of this was laid a stone of suitable size, the upper surface being smooth. At each edge was placed a large quantity of cement, and into the cement, at the 4 edges of this stone, were placed erect 4 others, their bottom edges resting on the cement, at the outer edges of the first stone. The 4 last named, when placed erect, formed a box. The corners, or where the edges of the 4 came in contact, were also cemented so firmly that the moisture from without was prevented from entering. It is to be so observed also that the inner surface of the 4 erect or side stones was smooth. This box was sufficiently large to admit a breastplate, such as was used by the ancients to defend the chest, etc., from the arrows and weapons of their enemy. From the bottom of the box, or from the breastplate, arise 3 small pillars composed of the same description of cement used on the edges, and upon these pillars was the plates." And then for some reason he says, "I must not forget to say that this box containing the record was covered with another stone, the bottom surface being flat and the upper crowning, but those 3 pillars were not so lengthy as to cause the plates and the crowning stone to come into contact." So if I'm seeing this right, there's kind of like he kind of set all the objects up off the ground. He didn't like make a box out of stones and just set them on the bottom of it. It seems like there's also these pillars that came up. Lucy Mack says the same thing. And he sets the objects on top of it. So in a sense, he's kind of, even if water was to pool down there, it would be away from the plates. And I'm not an expert in this, but it kind of sounds like he basically built a French drain, that the water could drain out of it, but that moisture wouldn't get into the sides of the box and it would all just drain out the bottom. I don't know. That's, these descriptions are sometimes tough for me to see through. So if you got lost in that, you're with me on that. It's kind of tough. So we get some stones in this box. There's silver bows and a breastplate, and apparently the bows attached to the breastplate. And then you get the Urim and Thummim, which apparently are transparent glass. We'll get into that in a moment. And the gold plates. And all these things were put together. There was also, it seems to me, the sword of Laban was in there. That's in a lot of accounts. And another account, which I'll show later, maybe there were other records as well in there. So there's more than just two items in there. So it might seem like, oh, there's a Urim and Thummim and, well, maybe three items, the Urim and Thummim, a breastplate, and the plates. But apparently there was more to it than that. And we actually get that in a canonized scripture called Doctrine and Covenants, section 17. So here it is. He lifts it off, and there it is. And there's some other stuff in there. And if you remember in Joseph's third visit, which was repeated to him again in the fourth visit, do not sell these for money. Don't use these for money. So this is from Oliver Cowdery's history. And in draft 2, it says, I was prevented by the angel from taking the plates because the time was not yet arrived. We get a lot more detail from an Oliver Cowdery history. Quote, on attempting to take possession of the records, a shock was produced upon his system by an invisible power which deprived him in a measure of his natural strength. He desisted for an instant and then made another attempt, but was more sensibly shocked than before. What was the occasion of this he knew not. There was the pure unsullied record as had been described. He had heard of the power or enchantment of 1,000 like stories which held the hidden treasures of the earth, and supposed that physical exertion and personal strength was only necessary to enable him to yet obtain the object of his wish. He therefore made the third attempt, with an increased exertion. When his strength failed him more than at either of the former times, and without premeditation, he exclaimed, why cannot I obtain this book? Because you have not kept the commandments of the Lord, answered a voice. Within a seeming short distance, he looked, and to his astonishment, there stood the angel who had previously given him directions concerning this matter. And a very interesting thing happens here. So Moroni comes and basically shocks him and says, no. Your heart's not in the right place, apparently. Oliver Cowdery offers this, which is repeated in the Wentworth letter and a couple of others. So this is a publicized account at the time. What Oliver Cowdery here is writing, by the way, is in the Times and Seasons. We have the original handwriting, but it was published in the church's newspaper at the time. And it says, quote, at that instant, he looked to the Lord in prayer, and as he prayed, darkness began to disperse from his mind, and his soul was lit up as it was the evening before. And he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And again did the Lord manifest his condescension and mercy. The heavens were opened, and the glory of the Lord shone round about and rested upon him. While he thus stood gazing and admiring, the angel said, look. And as he thus spake, he beheld the prince of darkness, surrounded by his innumerable train of associates. All this passed before him, and the heavenly messenger said, all this is shown, the good and the evil, the holy and impure, the glory of God and the power of darkness, that you may know hereafter the two powers and never be influenced or overcome by that wicked one. So Orson Pratt, The Interesting Account of Remarkable Visions, which was a tract in Europe, in England especially, quotes that word for word, just copies and pastes it. So an interesting account. So apparently there's a vision opened up to Joseph Smith about the amount of evil that's out there. I guess that's going to come after him. So that's the episode of the first time that Joseph goes to the Hill Cumorah. And then we get, of course, another one from the Lucy Mack Smith history, which is also in the Joseph Smith Papers Project on the website only, by the way. She says this, quote, after some further conversation, Joseph was then permitted to open and raise the stone again, and there he beheld the plates, the same as before. He reached forth his hand to take them, but was hurled back, thrown, the angel gone to the ground. When he recovered, he went as the angel was gone, and he rose and went to the house. We were much disturbed by this, as it showed to us more striking than anything, which had previously come to our understanding, the insinuations and power of the adversary. And we doubled our diligence in prayer before God that Joseph might be more fully instructed and preserved from all the wiles and machinations of the power of him who lieth in wait to deceive. So apparently it goes back to his family, which I think is interesting. We start getting into yearly visits. And there is in draft 2 in the Joseph Smith history, basically the angel Moroni says, I want you to come back here every year for 4 years. And we're going to do some training. We're going to do some, I don't know if he's teaching about it. There's no instance of what he's done, but maybe it's how do you translate? How do you use the Urim and Thummim? How do you not grab plates out of a box and get shocked and things like that? Who knows? And so Lucy Mack Smith's history says this. From this time forth, Joseph continued to receive instructions from time to time. And every evening we gathered our children together and gave our time up to the discussion of those things which he imparted unto us. I think that we presented the most peculiar aspect of any family that ever lived upon the earth, all seated round in a circle, father, mother, sons, and daughters, listening in breathless anxiety to the religious teachings of a boy, she says 19, scratches it out, 16 years of age, who had never read the Bible through by course in his life. For Joseph was less inclined to the study of books than any child we had, but much more given to reflection and deep study. We were convinced that God was about to bring to light something that we might stay our minds upon, something that we could get a more definite idea of than anything which had been taught us heretofore. And we rejoiced in it with exceedingly great joy. And the sweetest union and happiness pervaded our house. No jar nor discord disturbed our peace, and tranquility reigned in our midst. I think it's just really beautiful. Sorry. That's a lot to ask of a 16-year-old kid, and that's a lot to ask of a family to believe that. And again, I have a full understanding of people who may not want to believe this or think this is silly. And so take that into account, which I think is a very logical response. And listen to this mother describe how her family responded to it. It's just really remarkable. You can say that about any number of things, but that's an enormous amount of love of a family to their brother and to their son. She goes on to describe what Joseph would talk about. In course of our evening conversations, Joseph would give us some of the most amusing recitals which could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their manner of traveling, the animals which they rode, the cities that were built by them, the structure of their buildings, with every particular of their mode of warfare, their religious worship, as particularly as though he had spent his life with them. It will be recollected by the reader that all that I mentioned and much more took place within the compass of one short year. So I've included it in this part because I believe, according to this record, that a lot of this happened within that first year of the 4, in between when Joseph first meets Moroni in his bedroom that night, all the way through to when he receives the plates in 1827. So that's part 2. That's the Hill Cumorah. Again, going to get into some details a little later about some of the objects that were in there, but hopefully a bit of a precursor to a very touching story about a very, very loving family and a very important family to the Latter-day Saint and to the Community of Christ movement. So that's part 2. We'll move on to part 3, which is 4 years later. Okay, welcome to part 3. This is what I entitle 4 years later. So the first person that we get introduced to in this part of the narrative, so this is between 1823 and 1827. So there's 4 years. And the angel Moroni tells Joseph, hey, why don't you come back here every single year? We're going to have some communication. I'm assuming some training on a few things, but he's supposed to go back every single year. So in those 4 years, again, their condition has not improved. So they're still very poor. They're still working tirelessly about things. They can't really stop working. In fact, in a lot of the accounts that I've read, it's like I went and got the plates, came back, did my chores, and then moved on with it. I mean, they just couldn't stop. They did not have the means to stop. This was the only way that they could live. So this man by the name of Josiah Stoll comes into the picture. And draft 3, so this is Howard Corey's draft of the whole Joseph Smith history, says that there was believed to be what's called a Spaniard discovery of a silver mine. So apparently some Spaniards from, again, Spain, um, apparently there was a silver mine that they were doing, and Josiah Stoll wanted to get some people who were willing to work and go find the mine. And they worked at it for about a month, and it didn't really go anywhere. So this is elsewhere in the state of New York. This is a little bit more upstate New York. And so Joseph Sr. and Joseph Smith, as far as we know, went and worked for Josiah Stoll to try to find a silver mine that never actually came to pass. So they gave it a good heave-ho for about a month. What's interesting about this is there is a footnote here from the Joseph Smith papers, and kind of a fun article that came way later in the Daily Tribune of Salt Lake, which I think might have become later the Salt Lake Tribune. I don't know if it really matters much, but it was in a newspaper in Salt Lake City. So note 65 from the history drafts, between kind of like drafts 2 and 3 in volume 1 of the histories. It says, quote, Joseph Smith acknowledged receiving wages of $14 per month from Stoll for his assistance in treasure seeking. Additionally, Joseph Smith and his father purportedly were parties to a contract regarding shares in the distribution of any valuables that they found. So there were two things. Number one, I'm going to pay you for the labor that you do. And number two, you're going to get a cut of whatever we find. And that agreement, believe it or not, actually shows up in a newspaper in Salt Lake City here. And if you want to, you can read through that. At the end of the article, it's funny. It basically says, this guy sent this to us. It might have been by accident, but we're going to publish it anyway. So that's the agreement. And it could have been, and I didn't really dive too deep into that. It could have been anti-Mormonistic. It's like, oh, he was just a treasure seeker and here's proof that he did and all this kind of stuff. And so digging up plates out of the ground was just part of his fantasy. Or it could have just been like, hey, an interesting account. Here's for you to read. So either way, I don't know if it matters. It's the truth as it stands. Apparently that was the agreement that they made. Never happened. Nothing came of it. They never found anything, gave it up after a month. However, Josiah Stoll lives close to Isaac Hale and his family. And Isaac Hale has a daughter by the name of Emma Hale. And they have a friend by the name of Zechariah Tarbell. And so why do all those matter? Well, Joseph meets and falls in love with Emma. And there is a small account where Joseph was still kind of in mourning about Alvin, and so found a lot of personal solace in quite a remarkable woman. I mean, the Smiths couldn't say enough good about her. And if you know anything about the history of the church, she is an enormous influence for good. Writes our first hymn book. She's a part of the Female Relief Society. Loses children in childbirth, or shortly thereafter, quite frequently. I mean, she just is an incredible figure. And Joseph Smith falls in love, and they get married in the home of this guy against the wishes of their parents. So they don't really like the stories. They don't really like the fact that he's up in their neighborhood treasure seeking and he's a stranger to them. And so their parents were not into the idea. Isaac Hale actually speaks out a lot against the Smith family and against the whole Angel Moroni and the early foundations of the church and all that kind of stuff. Again, something that would make a lot of sense to me. I'm not going to trash on that too much because, under the circumstances, it does actually make sense. So some people would say that they eloped. You can say they got married. Again, a little different interpretations. However, I think they're both very accurate if you want to go there. So he meets and marries Emma Hale. They get married in South Bainbridge, New York, by Squire Tarbell, is how Draft 2 calls it. Now, Squire Tarbell is Zechariah Tarbell, a justice of the peace, and hence the title Squire. Okay. And from a document that I found called Regional Studies in Latter-day Saint Church History, it says that they lived about 4 miles from Stoll's house, Josiah Stoll's house, treasure seeker guy. The site is now part of the Afton Fairgrounds. So if you're in, South Bainbridge, go to the Afton Fairgrounds. Today, a historical marker on the site of the Tarbell home, erected in 1932 by the New York State Department of Education, mistakenly identifies Emma as Emily Hale. It reads, Mormon House, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, was married in this house January 18th, 1827 to Emily Hale, which is actually Emma Hale. So they get married, and since the Hale family is not really into this, they leave almost immediately after that and go back to Palmyra, where Joseph works with his father on the farm. There's not a whole lot of documentation from the papers There's a lot of other things out there, but I'm just focusing on the papers about Isaac Hale and his family's response to it. So I dug around a little further in the papers and actually found Emma's patriarchal blessing, when she gets a patriarchal blessing. Now, this is something that is still practiced today. There are still patriarchs today, or sometimes we call them evangelists. But a patriarch is, it used to be a church-wide calling, but now is a stake-wide calling, where you will go and receive a patriarch. A patriarch is a calling in the church, and this man will give you a blessing, tell you what your lineage is, and he'll tell you perhaps a little bit about your past, a little bit about your future. It's considered scripture, and it's actually held in the archives of the church. So these are very important blessings that are given to everyone. I have one. My wife has one. My mother has one. My grandmother has one. And these are very sacred documents and very sacred blessings in Latter-day Saint church culture. And so Emma's very touching. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because I get very emotional reading hers. Because later on it goes into some of the babies that she's lost. And it's just very touching. Anyway, this is Joseph Smith's father towards Emma. So I think it's hard to separate them. I think there's a lot of love there between the Smith family and Emma. And I'm hoping to convey that here, but also to maybe explain the feelings that they had at the time about the Hale family. So Emma's patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. says, "Thou hast grieved for the hardness of the hearts of thy father's house, and thou hast longed for their salvation. The Lord will have respect to thy cries, and by his judgments he will cause some of them to see their folly and repent of their sins. But it will be by affliction that they will be saved." So to give you kind of a sense of maybe how bitter that got. Oliver Cowdery was actually a party to a couple of agreements between Isaac Hale and Joseph Smith, which we'll get into in a later episode. And he writes, quote, while employed here, he became acquainted with the family of Isaac Hale, to whom you read in several of the publications of those who have sought to destroy the validity of the Book of Mormon. It may be necessary hereafter to refer you more particularly to the conduct of his family, as their influence has been considerably exerted to destroy the reputation of our brother. I believe he means Joseph Smith. Probably because he married a daughter of the same, contrary to some of their wishes, and in connection with this, to certain statements of some others of the inhabitants of that section of the country. So the guy didn't have a good reputation, and he married their daughter without consent. And so, yeah, I think that's all very reasonable, that they would not have a good relationship. There was a footnote in draft 2 in the Joseph Smith papers. It says, quote, Isaac Hale wrote later that he told Joseph Smith his reasons for refusing to consent to the marriage, some of which were that he was a stranger and followed a business that I could not approve, apparently referring to Joseph Smith's involvement with treasure seeking. And that's pretty much all you get about Isaac Hale in the Joseph Smith papers. We get some receipts, we get some agreements, signed documents in 1829 and 1830. That's later on, so we're not going to get into that now, but that's all you get. So apparently there was some tension there. So years have gone by. Joseph's now married. He's about 20, and he goes for his 4th visit. And like I said, in the history that we read about in the Pearl of Great Price, it is agreed upon that 4 years is going to be the time frame. So the Wentworth letter says, after having received many visits from the angels of God, unfolding the majesty and glory of the events that should transpire in the last days, on the morning of the 22nd of September, 1827, the angel of the Lord delivered the records into my hands. So that is 4 years to the day. So again, splitting hairs if you like, but it sounds like, he had his vision on the 21st overnight, tells his dad on the 22nd, goes straight to the hill, according to draft 2 that we usually read. And then 4 years, like 1827, September 22nd, that day is when he gets to actually retrieve the plates and, start translating is the idea. We get a description of the plates in the Wentworth letter. These records were engraven on plates which had the appearance of gold. Each plate was 6 inches wide and 8 inches long, and not so thick as common tin. They were filled with engravings in Egyptian characters and bound together in a volume as the leaves of a book with 3 rings running through the whole. The volume was something near 6 inches in thickness, a part of which was sealed. The characters on the unsealed part were small and beautifully engraved. The whole book exhibited many marks of antiquity in its construction and much skill in the art of engraving. So apparently the font size is very small. Take that description, copy paste it into Rupp's account in the book that he writes, copy paste that into Orson Pratt's interesting account, which is a tract that goes all over Europe. That's the description. So you're going to see a lot of replicas. I mean, people even sell these. You can find them on Etsy. A lot of them are not actually to scale, but, metal plates, about thickness is 10. There are some people out there I've seen which show that the characters are actually quite tiny. And so there's a lot of text on each page. Even though there is a sealed portion, we still get as many pages as we do get out of the Book of Mormon. So that's that. Then we get into, now that the plates and the items that are in that box come out of the box, we start getting some more descriptions, which is why I've waited to the description of the rest of it until now. So that's the plates. That's the gold plates. Urim and Thummim. Lots of stuff here, so forgive me for a second. There's some fascinating stuff about this. So again, Urim and Thummim is a Hebrew set of words, light and perfections, or other such close interpretations of that. Anyway, we get a description from the Times and Seasons. This is, again, a church newspaper from long ago. With the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. And I looked all over the place. There's a lot of various sites. There was one that I liked. It was called Priesthood on Judaism, and they actually copy a lot of their work into Wikipedia. So again, amateur historian is now going to go to Wikipedia. And I like this interpretation because a lot of really good, I think this one's a well-researched article, and I think it's done by a legitimate group. So thank you to whoever you are, Priesthood in Judaism. Thank you very much. This says, the description of the clothing of the Hebrew high priest in the book of Exodus portrays the Urim and Thummim as being put into the sacred breastplate worn by the high priest over the ephod. Where the biblical text elsewhere describes the ephod being used, scholars presume that it is referring to the use of the Urim and Thummim in conjunction with the ephod, as it seems to be intimately connected with it. Similarly, where non-prophets are portrayed as asking God for guidance, and the advice is not described as given by visions, scholars think that Urim and Thummim were the medium implied. So just to say that anciently, sort of Talmudic and rabbinical tradition and scholarship says that for some reason this Urim and Thummim is tied to a breastplate-like object, and those are used in conjunction with each other. Going further into that, according to classical rabbinical literature, in order for the Urim and Thummim to give an answer, it was first necessary for the individuals to stand facing the fully dressed high priest and vocalize the question briefly in a simple way, though it was not necessarily for it to be loud enough for anyone else to hear. Someone explains that the high priest would stand facing the Ark of the Covenant with the inquirer behind him, facing the priest's back. After the inquirer asked his question, the Holy Spirit would immediately overcome the priest, and he would see the letters protruding in a prophetic vision. The Talmudic rabbis argued that the Urim and Thummim were words written on the sacred breastplate. And there's a description of that. If you don't know, there are 12 stones on the ephod. And the idea is that the Urim and Thummim would project words onto the stones themselves, which is kind of strange because there's more Hebrew letters than there were stones on the ephod, so not sure how that worked. But apparently they were projected onto the breastplate somehow, and then the priest would be able to read them in his own language. All that to say, that's very similar to how Joseph apparently was seeing. He would look into this breastplate object idea, and he would be able to see the answers to his questions and that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants, and he would also be able to translate the Book of Mormon into English. There's some apocryphal writings that I couldn't find, and so I'm not going to include them, but they are also implying that if he didn't know how something sounded, he would just spell out the letters. Um, and there's a lot of instances where he doesn't go back and say, okay, where were we? He would just go back into, he put on this Urim and Thummim apparatus and just keep going. So there was never any proofreading. There was never any going back. And in some cases, apparently, if the words would appear and the scribe would write them down, Martin Harris, Emma Smith, even Oliver Cowdery, and if they didn't get it right or something like that, it would just kind of stay there. And he would just kind of keep at it until they got it right, never looking at them, and then continue going on. So again, what he's describing is very interesting because it matches what I found here in this Priesthood in Judaism article that I found on Wikipedia. The only other time that we get Urim and Thummim language outside of the Old Testament and the Doctrine and Covenants is in the Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price. And that says, "And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in Ur of the Chaldees." And that's how Abraham apparently received some of his revelations as well. So again, that's in the Book of Abraham. That's a Latter-day Saint scripture that's placed in the Pearl of Great Price, translated from papyrus, much later on in the story. So we won't get into that too much here. This idea of Urim and Thummim actually gets a little confusing. So he starts calling, Joseph Smith and others start calling other things Urim and Thummim. So it's not just two specific stones fastened to the rim of a bow, so forth and so on. There's a William Clayton journal excerpt that later becomes what we now call Doctrine and Covenants, section 30. And it describes the entire earth will one day become a Urim and Thummim. So just to kind of give a full explanation of what this term means, this is what we have, which is now, again, I'm just going to read it from William Clayton's journal, but it's now a section of the Doctrine and Covenants. It says, "But there is no angel ministers to this earth, only what either does belong or has belonged to this earth. And the angels do not reside on a planet like our earth, but they dwell with God, and the planet where he dwells is like crystal, and like a sea of glass before the throne. This is the great Urim and Thummim, whereon all things are manifest, both things past, present, and future, and are continually before the Lord. The Urim and Thummim is a small representation of this globe. The earth, when it is purified, will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim, whereby all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be manifest to those who dwell on it. And this earth will be with Christ. Then the white stone mentioned in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7, is the Urim and Thummim, whereby all things pertaining to a higher order of kingdoms, even all kingdoms, will be made known. And the white stone is given to each of those who come into this, the celestial kingdom, whereon is a new name written, which no man knoweth, save he that receiveth it. The new name is a key word." So this kind of goes back to what, again, priesthood and some of the Judaistic writings are saying, is that these stones were also engraven. They had words on them. And you can even, some people Etsy these, you can buy these, where it has a Hebrew form of Urim and Thummim on two stones. And in this case, what we're basically saying is that there's Urim and Thummims all over the place. And so because of that, what you get is the seer stone, which this object was actually published when they printed out the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which again is a very rare move for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because this is an artifact, and we don't really put a whole lot of stock into like objects and artifacts like that. But in this case, this apparently is the seer stone that Joseph also used to translate the Book of Mormon. So apparently, according to Joseph, one interpretation of Urim and Thummim is the spectacles. Again, you can kind of see here a breastplate looking through and translating into English. The other one is he would place this seer stone into a hat to kind of crowd out the light, so to speak, and be able to read things from the stone. And the scribe would write them down. There's also instances sometimes where maybe Joseph himself could consider himself a Urim and Thummim, because There's some instances, and it's depicted in films, where he's just reading off the text of the gold plates. And in some cases, even that he just kind of walks around the room and speaks. So pretty generous with this term. I think for our purposes, in our time, I should say, we call the Urim and Thummim the clear glass, the breastplate object. Then we have a seer stone. Then we have, just Joseph being a translator, a revelator, a prophet and a seer. And then, him walking around the room could be considered that. We try to delineate those just so it's not so confusing. Anyway, so there you go. So I got this one from churchofjesuschrist.org about Lucy Mack Smith. It says, she was an eyewitness to the events surrounding the Book of Mormon translation and testified that she hefted the plates and handled the Urim and Thummim. And so because I found that on the church's website, and I found this in the Joseph Smith papers, this is a description from Mother Smith. And I think this is where a lot of people get their ideas about what the Urim and Thummim that was in the same box as the gold plates is. She says, and I'm going to back up a little. This is a really wonderful story. So something horrible had happened. I'm not going to get into it too much for the sake of time, but something horrible had happened, and Lucy was trying to keep it together. And she had to kind of go into the next room to try to keep her emotions together. And she was very emotional, so she leaves the room and goes into another room. And so Joseph Smith follows her into the other room because he's trying to attend to his mother. I just think that's wonderful. And then she says this. Mother said he, do not be uneasy. All is right. See here, said he, I have got the key. I know not what he meant, but he took the article in my hands, and after examining it, with no covering but a silk handkerchief, found that it consisted of 2 smooth, 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows. Stones connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles are made. So if you're wondering where that image comes from, I believe it's from Lucy Mack Smith's history. So she actually got to feel them and describe them. And then there's some other items that we get out of what he takes out of, his 4th visit out of the stone box. This one is noted in section 17, and as a side note, it's kind of interesting. Section 17 does not appear in Revelation Book 1. It's only in Revelation Book 2. Apparently, it was copied over into Revelation Book 2, and it's a good thing, because if they didn't, we wouldn't have it. Apparently, it was removed from Revelation Book 1 and never put back, so it's gone from that book. Anyway, section 17, this is canonized in our scriptures, says that there was also the sword of Laban, and I really don't get anything else out of any of these books about the sword of Laban. I'm very sorry. You can look up various depictions of what people thought it looked like, but not really much there. Then we get a breastplate. Again, Lucy Mack Smith gives us a description. When he returned, he requested me to come downstairs. And I love this. I told him I could not leave my work just then, but as he still insisted, I finally concluded to go down and see what he wanted. I love that. He's like, hey, Mom, can you come downstairs? Mom, come downstairs. Come down right now. I got to show you something. Again, we're all still just people. I love it. Anyway, I digress. After upon meeting him, he handed me the breastplate spoken of in his history. It was wrapped in a thin muslin handkerchief, so thin that I could see the glistening metal and ascertain or feel its proportions without any difficulty. It was concave on one side and convex on the other, and extended from the neck downwards as far as the center of the stomach of a man of extraordinary size. It had 4 straps of the same material for the purpose of fastening it to the breast, 2 of which ran back to go over the shoulders, and the other 2 were designed to fasten to the hips. These straps were just the width of my 2 fingers, for I measured them, and they had holes in the end of them for convenience in fastening. The whole plate was worth at least $500. Scratch that out. Which plate, together with the Urim and Thummim, Joseph placed, and the Urim and Thummim, in the chest after I examined it. So I don't know if these 2 instances of feeling these objects happened at the same time, but apparently there was a box or a chest made that he sort of placed all these objects into it. The other thing that we get, again, from Revelation Book 2, is that the directors are in there as well. And we interpret that as the Liahona, so there was a compass-like object given to Lehi when him and his family leave Jerusalem 600 years before Christ is born, and it helps them go through the wilderness. Apparently, that object, that liahona, or the director, the ball and directors, whatever those may look like, are also in the box, and Joseph has those as well. So from Revelation book 2, we see, "Behold, I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, which if you do with full purpose of heart, you shall have a view of the breastplate, and also the breastplate, the sword of Laban, Urim and Thummim, which was given to the brother of Jared upon the mount when he talked with the Lord face to face, and the marvelous directors, which was given to Lehi while in the wilderness on the borders of the Red Sea, and it is by your faith that you shall obtain a view of them." So there's a clarification here. We talked a lot about the Urim and Thummim in Hebrew tradition. These are not the same ones. So wherever those are, we don't really know. There's a lot of rabbinical tradition that they either stopped working or were lost entirely. But in this case, this is talking about two stones that were handed to the brother of Jared, I believe on a place called Mount Zarin. This is coming out of the Book of Ether in our Book of Mormon, where the brother of Jared comes to the Lord with some stones to touch so that they can have light in vessels as they cross the ocean for about a year. It takes about a year for that trip to happen. And he goes up with 16 stones and comes back with 2 extras. And the 2 extras are what they call interpreters, and whoever uses those is called a seer. So if you're curious, these are not like somehow taken from the Middle East. These apparently were given to the brother of Jared on sort of the Asiatic continent, European continent. We're not really sure where the boat left, but yeah, apparently the Urim and Thummim that is in the possession of Joseph Smith at this point is from that instance. So those stones traveled to America by boat and stayed there, and we can maybe they're still around somewhere on this continent, but that's what we're talking about here. We do see an instance of other records. So David Whitmer, who is one of the 3 witnesses, told several interviewers in the 1870s and 1880s that he saw additional items on this occasion. Most of these later accounts listed the gold plates, the interpreters, or Urim and Thummim, the sword of Laban, the directors, Leahona, and additional records. In some, Whitmer also mentioned the breastplate. So apparently there might have been some other objects in the box. There's once again a warning. When Joseph retrieves all this stuff, there's once again a warning that says people are going to try to take these from you. They're going to try to kill you. They're trying to get the gold. They're going to try to get rich. They're going to try to discredit you. You have to be careful about this, right? So that's it. That's a lot for that. But just to give you some examples of apparently the things that Joseph took with him, or maybe left in the box. But the 3 witnesses were able to see these objects, and Mother Smith and others were able to maybe kind of see these objects. But he never, as far as we know, maybe Oliver Cowdery used the Urim and Thummim when he did some translation, which we see in section 9 of the Doctrine and Covenants as we currently have it. But otherwise, pretty much the plates and the rest of the objects were mostly kept hidden for a while during the translation process. So then we get, almost immediately after that happens, the persecution, because they start finding out about plates of gold and all this stuff. Everybody just kind of goes nuts on them. And so they need to leave, but they're way too poor. So again, Joseph's just been married. He got booted out of there. He comes back to his father. He works with him for a while. He gets the plates. And then again, things become so unbearable. And this man named Martin Harris shows up. Now, he's been in the neighborhood longer than them. He's been there since 1793. So he's been in Palmyra area. It used to be called... Swift's Landing. So he's been there for 34 years. He's been there a long time. Prominent farmer. He's from the same neighborhood. There's a kind of a People's Glossary in the Joseph Smith Papers, and it says this. He says he moved with his parents to the area of Swift's Landing, which is later in Palmyra, Ontario County, New York. In 1793, married his first cousin, Lucy Harris, on the 27th of March, 1808, in Palmyra. He served in the War of 1812 in the New York militia. Thought that was interesting. I didn't know that. Became a landowner of some 320 acres at Palmyra. So this is a very prominent farmer. He, just so that you know, he paid the printing costs for the publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830 through the sale of 151 of his acres of land. So he still had plenty left over. And needless to say, his wife was not into that idea. We'll get to that later in another episode. What's also really fun about this guy is he was baptized into the church 3 times. He was baptized into the church when he became a member on the April 6th, 1830, when the church was organized. He was one of the founding members and one of the 3 witnesses. So he was part of actually choosing the apostles. This is a very prominent person in the church at the time. Again, funded it. I think gave $5,000 to print 3,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. He is excommunicated in December of 1837. And then he is rebaptized into the church in Kirtland in 1842. So during Joseph's lifetime, Martin Harris is baptized, excommunicated, and rebaptized. Then he gets involved with some of the offshoot groups, not the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but some other, I won't get into the details of it, but other faiths that also sort of believed in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. So in essence, he kind of leaves. I don't have a record of him being excommunicated from that, but he migrates to the Utah Valley in 1870. He's rebaptized into the church in 1870. And that is not uncommon. Most of the members of the church, as I've read in the Journal of Discourses, are rebaptized once they get to Utah, not because they're excommunicated. I believe even Brigham Young was rebaptized. It's just, I think they just recommitted to their covenants, is to put it in my language, and forgive me if that's too simplistic. And then he dies in Clarkston, Cache County, Utah Territory. So he is buried in the state of Utah, in Cache County. So that's who he is. Now, why all that? He gives Joseph and Eva $50 so that they can make it to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then while they're there, because he knows that where they are, assists with scribal work. And what we call the Book of Lehi is translated. Now, we call it that, and we've never read it because the 116 pages of that translation were lost. And most of the early sections of the Doctrine and Covenant have to do with being naughty and losing those pages and the very harsh punishments that come upon that. But this is a very, very influential person. So as far as we know from our records, Emma Smith is now helping translate some of these 116 pages. Martin Harris comes down. He also scribes 116 pages. And a lot of this because Joseph just frankly doesn't know how to write some of these words, and his penmanship isn't so great. So they're helping him do it. And that's where we're going to stop on that because the actual translation comes later. Oliver Cowdery enters the picture later. I am not going to get into that quite yet because we'll just go on and on and on. Like I said, there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down. But that is kind of where we stop. Those are the 4 years coming to an end. And then there's a very interesting account of what I call Mr. Harris Goes to New York, where they try to get some legitimacy behind this so that people stop all the persecution and the violence that is being levied towards this family and towards Joseph Smith. So that's part 3, a lot to do with what was buried in the Hill of Cumorah. And in part 4, we're going to be talking about some efforts to, in my phrase, legitimize this project that they're doing. All right, part 4, Mr. Harris Goes to New York. This is going to be a relatively short episode, just because, again, we can go on and on and on, but I'm trying to constrain it down to what's in the Joseph Smith papers. So again, Martin Harris, very, very important figure here. He not only gives Joseph and Emma $15 so that they can, or $50, just to be very clear, $50 to make it to Harmony, Pennsylvania, so that Joseph can start translating. And Emma is helping him. And then Martin Harris himself comes down and helps translate. And they're translating, they get to about 116 pages of what was called the Book of Lehi, which we no longer have. And he's getting a lot of flack from his wife, from his family back in Palmyra. There's a lot of people going after the Smith family. They're just really not happy with this story. They don't want this as part of their community. And so Martin Harris apparently knew a few rather influential people in New York City. So he kind of is coming after, and in some cases teases Joseph Smith to say, look, can you just give me some of the translation and then let me just copy down some characters, show us what they look like. And I'll take it to New York and I'll have them researched. So Joseph kind of reluctantly does that. And he takes it, now in draft 2, it says, he went to Charles Anthon, who says, yeah, these are true. And then when he finds out they're like, quote unquote, from God, he sort of throws a fit, tears up his certificate that he was going to give him. And then he goes to somebody named Dr. Mitchell. So I've tried to fill this out a little bit. There's actually how did he know about Charles Anthony? How did he know about Samuel Mitchell, by the way, is Dr. Mitchell? Well, apparently it's through a friend or an acquaintance called Luther Brandish. Just a little bit about Luther Brandish, just to help you understand how this comes together. So Brandish had been in the Middle East for 6 years, from 1819 to 1825, as a special envoy to John Quincy Adams, and knew all about the War of the Consuls between Great Britain and France. Yet another probable reason Harris visited Brandish was that he knew New York City well and was acquainted with many of its most illustrious citizens. Most importantly, for this study, he knew Professor Samuel Latham Mitchell, and in all likelihood was responsible for pointing his Palmyra friend in the direction of the man who many believed was the greatest living American naturalist. While we do not know the content of Harris's conversation with Brandish, to the best of our current knowledge, neither man mentioned it. We do know that after his visit with Brandish, Harris went on to see Dr. Mitchell and Professor Charles Anthon of Columbia College. So if you're wondering how the connection is made, that's how it's made. The characters in the translation are taken to Charles Anthon, and what was taken. So we don't really hear much other than Charles Anthon's like, oh yeah, they're Egyptian, they're Chaldaic or Chaldaic, however you want to say that. These are authentic, and I'll write you a certificate to the same. And he does that. And he's like, by the way, where'd you get this from? And he says, oh, well, this kid in upstate New York saw an angel come through his house and found some books in the earth and is translating them by the gift and power of God. And the guy's like, hey, can I see that certificate really quick? He's like, yeah, sure. Tears it up, and he says, I guess that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Bring me the record and I'll do it myself. And he says, well, part of it's sealed. And I've read a couple of accounts where apparently this was our sarcastic comment that Charles Anthon made, but basically he says, I cannot read a sealed book. And this is very detailed in the Joseph Smith history in that he's like, this is a fulfillment of a prophecy. So Charles Anthon, it doesn't go so well with him. But then he goes to this man named Samuel Mitchell, who does confirm that, yes, these characters are accurate. So this one might be a fun one for you guys. Hiram Smith owned what was called a broadside. Now, if you were printing back then and you wanted to print something really big and kind of take up the whole, page, which is these are very large newspaper pages, you have what's called a broadside sheet. And I found this. It's a very interesting item. It's leafed in gold. And this basically, the reason why I show you this is because apparently these are the characters that Charles Anthon looked at and that Dr. Mitchell looked at. So if you want to know exactly what was done, this was in the possession of Hiram Smith for a long time. These are they. We also have John Whitmer. Here's some characters that John Whitmer copied down. And then we have Oliver Cowdery. Copies down some characters. He copies down a whopping 2 characters, so maybe not as cool, but yeah. There are in church history, like in the 20th century, there were copies of the Book of Mormon that were made to look, the cover was made to look golden, and then there were some characters copied onto it, and they kind of used these to kind of show, like, this is what the gold plates look like. They don't print them like that anymore. It's been decades and decades since they've done that, but it's kind of fun. Anyway, so these are the characters that was shown. And this, if you want to know, this is what Joseph Smith was translating into English. This is what apparently he was using. So a little bit more about Samuel Mitchell. We have a photo of him, but also a photo. Look at this grave. His grave is just very elaborate. So he was a very influential man. Anyway, History of the Church, page 20, again, because it's based a lot on the same records that we're reading in the Joseph Smith papers, says apparently that he might have gone to Dr. Mitchell first, then to Charles Anthon, then back to Dr. Mitchell again. So that's just a footnote, little extra detail there. He was a very influential scientist and politician, and just like I said, has a fabulous gravesite. So that's that. So there's some of the characters, some of the extra things that we get. How did a guy from upstate New York, a farmer from upstate New York, get hooked into Columbia University? This is how. Charles Anthony is also a very, very influential. He was a politician. He was an academic, and rather, I mean, from his photo, it looks like he's rather pleased with himself as well. But yeah, just a little bit more about these people and who they are. And in part 5, we're going to be talking about Joseph Smith Sr. and Alvin and the kind of influence that they had. Again, a little anecdotal, maybe not as factual, just kind of a bonus round here if you're interested. And if you're not interested, then thank you for watching the episode. But if you are, we'll move on to part 5. Okay, so this is part 5, sort of an added thing. And I wanted to get into the kind of people that Joseph was surrounded by during this time. And again, this is slightly off topic, but we don't get a lot of things about Alvin Smith because he does die before the Book of Mormon is even ever published. And we'll get into some of the details there. Something anecdotal that I just wanted to point out about a relationship of a father and a son and a brother at this point, and of this family in general, which I've mentioned in the previous parts to this episode. Something that was striking to me as I was researching this. So in the Joseph Smith history, as we have it in Latter-day Saint scripture today, in the Pearl of Great Price, there's a break. So, Joseph more or less receives the plates, and then there's a break, and then Oliver Cowdery shows up on the scene. In that break, again, in the History of the Church, Volume 1, where all this used to come from, there's some sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that are there. So there's quite a few things. So it makes sense that the scriptorians of the church would remove these because they are already in the Doctrine and Covenants. So it's not like they were removed. They're just kind of placed elsewhere. But just something to note here. In the history of the church, if you were to read it as it was originally intended, draft 2 sort of thing, it includes 4 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 3. So section 1 is the not the preamble. What am I thinking of here? It's the preface to the whole thing. That was given years later. So that's out of order chronologically. Section 2, as we have it, is an excerpt from Moroni's visit. So the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants you get is section 3. So section 3 is there. That is about the loss of the Book of Lehi, so the 116 pages. And the Urim and Thummim is taken away from Joseph, and he can't translate anymore. He messed up. Martin Harris messes up. It's no good. Section 4 is the famous missionary scripture, Called to Serve. I'll get to that in a second. Section 5 is a covenant with Martin Harris and a warning and a kind of a prelude to what the 3 witnesses are going to be. But again, it's kind of negative. It's like, Martin, you messed up, and we need to really, really lay down some ground rules here. This is the Lord speaking through the Urim and Thummim. And then we also skip ahead and get section 10. Again, the loss of the Book of Lehi, and you are not to translate again. But then the Urim and Thummim is given back. It's kind of funny. According to the record, the Urim and Thummim has been taken away because they lost these pages. Joseph's devastated about it. Martin's devastated about it. By the way, Martin and his wife later in 1830 actually separate. So, and he marries somebody else later on because that relationship's a little toxic. Anyway, so the angel appears, which we assume is Moroni, and says, "Here's the Urim and Thummim, Joseph." And he looks in the Urim and Thummim, gets a chide, gets like kind of yelled at, and then has to hand the Urim and Thummim back to him again. So these sections that we're skipping over in Joseph Smith's history are all negative. They're all like, how dare you? Like, you did something wrong, you sinned, so forth and so on, except section 4. And I think this is notable. Section 4 was given to the one guy that never served a proselyting mission for the church. Samuel Smith is the first proselyting missionary for the church. Brigham goes on a mission. Joseph Smith goes on a mission. Oliver Cowdery goes on a mission. Joseph Smith Sr. does not go on a mission. He becomes the patriarch of the church. But this, behold, a marvelous work is about to come forth among the children of men. I know it because I served a full-time mission for the church. This enormously important section is given in loving terms with hope to his father. So if you're a believer and this is coming from the Lord, this should indicate the kind of person that Joseph Smith Sr. was. And from Lucy Mack's account, the fact that the angel Moroni says, "Why aren't you telling your dad?" He'll believe you. That's just a remarkable thing. And I'm not going to get into it too much, but Lucy Mack Smith's history goes back into Joseph's father, Joseph's grandfather, having visions and dreams and revelations and believing them. So this is a very believing family. And I just wanted to point out that while there's a lot of negativity in the front sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, just remember that Joseph's father seems to still be this really, really wonderful man. There's a ton about Hyrum Smith. He's called a man of integrity from the Lord in later revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants. Just a remarkable man. But for now, we get this about Joseph Smith Sr. So I just wanted to kind of put kind of seal the deal on Joseph Smith Sr. before moving on to the next episode. And then we don't get a whole lot about Alvin beforehand, although he was a wonderful influence on his family. Some stories about Alvin Smith that I think are great before he passes away. And trying to bring some of this together just to show the kind of family that Joseph Smith was surrounded by. From, again, Lucy Mack Smith's history. Lucy Smack, I might as well just call her that. Lucy Mack Smith, I'm sorry. Quote, "When Joseph came in the evening, he told all or the whole family that he had made known unto his father in the field. We sat up very late and listened attentively to all that he had to say to us. But his mind had been so exhausted that he became very much fatigued. When Alvin saw this, he said, 'Now, brother, let us go to bed. And we will get up early in the morning and go to work so as to finish our day's labor by an hour before sunset. And if mother will get our suppers early, we will then have a fine long evening and all set down and hear you talk.' The next day we worked with great ambition. By sunset, we're ready to be seated and give our attention undivided to Joseph's recitals." And this, before he began to explain to us the instructions which he had received, he charged us not to mention what he had told us out of the family, as the world was so wicked that if when they did come to a knowledge of these things, they would try to take our lives as soon as we obtained the plates. Our names would be cast out as evil by all people. We were ready by sunset to give our whole attention to the discourse of my son pertaining to the obtaining of the plates, the goodness of God, his knowledge and power of our own liability, to error and transgression, and the great salvation that lay before the faithful. Now he said, he, father and mother, the angel of the Lord says that we must be careful not to proclaim these things or to mention them abroad, for we do not know, any of us know the wickedness of the world, which is so sinful, and that when we get the plates, they will want to kill us for the sake of the gold. Now, that's a long story, but to say, according to Lucy Mack, Alvin was this, he was taking care. He's like, "Joseph, you're tired. Why don't you go to bed? And we'll all get up." He sort of announced it, all of us, how about we all work really hard, and then we can come back? Because, again, these people were very poor, and they had to just go at it. So they didn't have any time to do anything, but he's taking care of his brother. And then his brother's taking care of his family by saying, before I start any of this, you can't tell anybody because they're going to kill you, which they did try to do a few times. So that's Alvin. A brother who later on gets a kind of a Bilbois plague, I believe it was called, or a choleric. Gets cholera, more or less. And a doctor comes and gives him a chamomile, which gets lodged in his stomach. And I might be saying the term of that. But anyway, he gives him a medication that gets lodged in his stomach, and he dies an extraordinarily painful death. And sort of famously says to his brother, "You have to be faithful in getting the record." He really believed him to the day he died. Never saw the church organized, never saw the Book of Mormon published. And in a lot of church artistic depictions, Alvin is much more of a prominent figure in Joseph's life. In a film that I actually performed in, where I played Oliver Cowdery, the family had a really hard time with Joseph passing. They mention Alvin, or I'm sorry, with Alvin passing, and they mention Alvin when the Book of Mormon is published. And then Alvin later on, it does appear in the Doctrine and Covenants, as Joseph has a vision of him in the spirit world. And he's like, well, how's that possible? He died before the church was even organized. And this sort of the promise is made that, anybody who would have, like, we understand it's not fair. Not everybody is born after 1830. And anybody who was born before that, if they would have received it, they will be treated fairly and they will be given an equal chance like everybody else. Which, if you're not familiar with our faith, is the entire reason why we build temples, is to give ourselves the covenants, but also to give them to people who didn't have a chance to. So it's a really beautiful thing. So Alvin is this very central figure. And so I love that I could find this about him from his mother's own mouth or own hand. So Joseph Smith Sr., going back to him, he is the church's first patriarch, and the Church of Jesus Christ.org is enormously kind of brief here. Says, quote, a patriarch is a priesthood holder who is ordained to give special patriarchal blessings to members of the church, unquote. Full stop. That's all you get. So I had to go elsewhere talking about patriarchal blessings. Every worthy baptized member is entitled to and should receive a patriarchal blessing, which provides inspired direction from the Lord. Patriarchal blessings include a declaration of a person's lineage in the house of Israel and contain personal counsel from the Lord. As a person studies his or her patriarchal blessing and follows the counsel it contains, it will provide guidance, comfort, and protection. Why am I stating that? Previously in a part, we talked about Emma Smith's patriarchal blessing. This is what she was receiving. And then we get, again, a father's affection to his son. He gave it to Emma Smith. They loved Emma Hale Smith, right? And just wanted to kind of, again, wrap a bow on it and give you a portion of Joseph Smith's patriarchal blessing, which was given to him by his father. This is in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. It says, thou hast suffered much in thy youth, and the poverty and afflictions of thy father's family have been a grief to thy soul. Thou hast desired to see them delivered from bondage, for thou hast loved them with a perfect love. Thou hast stood by thy father, and like Shem, would have covered his nakedness rather than see him exposed to shame. When the daughters of the Gentiles laughed, thy heart has been moved with a just anger to avenge thy kindred. Thou hast been an obedient son. The commandments of thy father and the reproofs of my mother thou hast respected and obeyed. For all these things the Lord thy God will bless thee. So just wanted to give us a sense of the kind of love, even to the point where Joseph Smith, it seems to me in this patriarchal blessing, is almost apologizing to his son. Like, I'm sorry I didn't make more money. I'm sorry we didn't live more comfortably. It's made a lot of this process really hard for you. Just a lot of love there. And so if there's a call to action here, just from a silly guy making a podcast in his library, just take an example of the kind of love that these people showed. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how much we owe to that first family. I don't think we would have the church today. We wouldn't have the Book of Mormon. We wouldn't have any of this stuff if it wasn't for a family that had an enormous amount of love and respect and kindness towards each other. Parents to Alvin, to Hiram, to Joseph, Sophronia, Lucy Mack. I mean, they all loved each other and accomplished some really great things because of it. So maybe sort of an inspirational message on quite an inspirational family. So thank you again for watching. We'll be back hopefully next week talking a little bit about the early sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, which include the translation efforts of the Book of Mormon, some of the problems that they ran into, some of the setbacks that they ran into. So we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.